Picture this.
My queen,
You are Lucius Coranius,
council
a
demands
Roman
your
envoy
presence to
standing in a
discuss the
barbarian
treaty.
court. And you have just made a fatal mistake. You aren't here to negotiate. You're here to dictate terms to Teuta, the pirate queen of the RDA. The air is tense. You sneer at her, declaring that if she won't leash her people, Rome will teach her how to rule. You expect her to cower. Instead, she smiles, a cold, thin expression that doesn't reach her eyes. She dismisses you with a lazy wave of her hand. You turn on your heel, marching back to your ship, confident that your threat has landed. It has, but not the way you intended. As you step onto the gangplank, the sun glinting off the Adriatic, you don't see the assassin emerging from the shadow of the hull. You only feel the sudden burning tear of steel across your throat. You gargle on your own blood, collapsing onto the wooden deck while the Queen's guards watch, unmoved. You are the first Roman diplomat to be butchered in cold blood for decades. And as your vision fades, you realize you have just started a war with the most dangerous sailors in the ancient world, the Illyrians. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curios about the past. That murder in 230 BC was not just a crime. It was a slap across the face of the Mediterranean's newest superpower. Rome had just finished strangling the life out of Carthage in the First Punic War. The Senate was high on victory. They looked at the map and saw the Mediterranean as their private swimming pool. To them, the tribes across the Adriatic Sea were nothing more than a nuisance, gnats buzzing around the head of a lion. But these were no ordinary gnats. While the Roman legions were perfecting the art of infantry combat on land, the Illyrians were rewriting the rules of naval warfare. Operating from the jagged island-choked coast of modern-day Dalmatia, they had turned piracy into a state-sponsored industry. They didn't just raid for gold, they raided for survival. The rocky soil of the Balkans couldn't support large-scale agriculture, so they harvested the sea. Every merchant ship sailing from Greece to Italy had to pass through their hunting grounds. Under King Agron, the RDI tribe had forged these desperate raiding parties into a terrifying confederacy. Agron was a warlord of the old breed, violent, charismatic, and excessively fond of unmixed wine. After a massive victory against the Atlians, he celebrated so hard that he developed piracy and died within days. This left the throne to his wife, Teuta. Rome saw a window of opportunity. The Senate received reports that Italian merchants were being dragged off their ships and sold into slavery. They assumed a widow regent would be easy to bully. They dispatched the Coranius brothers to Aristica, dripping with Roman arrogance, to Scodra. The meeting was a collision of two incompatible worlds. The Romans demanded Teuta stop her subjects from piracy immediately. Teuta looked at them with genuine confusion. In Illyrian culture, piracy was a legitimate trade, a private enterprise like fishing or pottery. She explained that it was not the custom of kings to prevent their subjects from winning. Booty, the younger Corinius snapped. He insulted her laws, and implicitly threatened invasion. He treated her like an unruly vassal, not a sovereign queen. Teuta didn't explode in rage. She simply decided that this Roman insolence required a permanent correction. When news of the assassination reached Rome, the Senate was stunned into silence. Killing an envoy was a violation of Zana. The sacred law of nations that protected diplomats, even among enemies. It was an act of war so blatant, so personal, that it bypassed all political debate. The legions were mobilized, the fleet was launched, Rome prepared to crush the barbarian queen. But as the heavy Roman quinquer lumbered into the Adriatic, they discovered a terrifying truth. They weren't fighting a disorganized rabble. They were sailing into a labyrinth, defended by a people who knew every current, every hidden cove, and every way to kill a slow-moving giant. To understand why a single diplomat's murder could trigger an international crisis, we must look away from the marble columns of Rome and gaze at the jagged spine of the ancient Balkans. The kingdom of the RDA did not look like any civilization the Romans recognized. There were no grand forums, no paved roads stretching to the horizon, and no senate debating philosophy. Instead, the Illyrian power base was carved directly into the living rock of the Dalmatian coast. Geography is destiny, and nowhere was this truer than in Illyria. The Dinaric Alps form a massive, impenetrable wall separating the coast from the interior. For a Roman general, this terrain was an enigma of logistical bottlenecks and ambush points, but for a pirate, it was a fortress built by the gods. The coastline is a fractured mosaic of over 1,000 islands, hidden coves, and deep, twisting fjords. A ship could vanish into this labyrinth in seconds, hidden from pursuit by towering limestone cliffs that plunged vertically into the sea. This harsh environment dictated their economy. The rocky soil of the coast was stingy, yielding little wheat or olive oil. Survival required looking outward toward the rich trade routes connecting Greece and Italy. For the tribes living here, raiding wasn't a moral failing, it was a necessity. They harvested the merchant fleets just as a farmer harvests his field. Over centuries, this necessity evolved into a sophisticated culture of predation. The RDA kingdom rose to power by mastering this environment. Under the late King Agron, they had centralized the loose collection of tribes into a formidable state apparatus. Agron didn't just lead raids, he taxed them. He built a system where local chieftains provided ships and warriors in exchange for a share of the spoils and protection. It was a mafia-style protection racket, but on a geopolitical scale. When Teuta assumed the regency for her young stepson, Pin, she inherited this volatile machine. Her position was far more precarious than the Romans realized. In the hyper-masculine warrior culture of the Illyrians, a leader maintained power solely through the distribution of wealth. If Teuta had bowed to Roman demands and stopped the piracy, she would have cut off the flow of gold and slaves that kept her chieftains loyal. The moment she ordered the fleets to dock, she would have faced a mutiny. Her refusal to Corinius wasn't just arrogance, it was a calculation for political survival. Teuta had to prove she was strong enough to fill Agron's boots. She authorized aggressive expansion southwards, targeting the wealthy Greek colonies that dotted the coast. Her commanders besieged the island of Issa and attacked the city of Epidamnos. These weren't chaotic skirmishes. The Illyrians employed siege engines, coordinated infantry maneuvers, and psychological warfare. They terrified the Greeks not just with their violence, but with their discipline. The court at Skodra reflected this martial focus. It was a place where wine flowed as freely as blood. The Illyrians were famous, or infamous, throughout antiquity for their drinking culture. Even the Greeks who loved their wine were appalled by the Illyrian habit of drinking unmixed wine in massive quantities, leading to rowdy feasts where business and violence often intermingled. It was in this atmosphere of intoxicated aggression that Teuta held court, surrounded by warriors who measured a leader's worth by the terror they could inflict. On the enemy, Rome saw a barbarian woman. In reality, they were facing a cornered tiger. Teuta controlled a network of fortified harbors stretching from modern-day Split down to Duras. Her pirate empire was a nimble, decentralized hydra. You could burn one village, sink one fleet, but the hydra would simply withdraw into the mountains or slip behind an island, waiting for the storm to pass. Romans were bringing a hammer to kill a swarm of wasps. They were about to learn that brute force is useless when your enemy refuses to stand still. When the Roman navy finally launched its counterattack, they brought the heavyweight champions of the Mediterranean to the fight, the quinqueremes. These were floating fortresses powered by nearly 300 oarsmen designed to smash into enemy hulls with the force of a battering ram. A single Roman ship was a masterpiece of engineering, carrying a complement of 120 marines, ready to board and butcher anything in their path. Against Carthage, this strategy of brute force had worked. But the Adriatic was not the open ocean, and the Illyrians were not interested in a fair fight. Deep within the shipyards of the Lernians, a tribe renowned for their naval ingenuity, the Illyrians had perfected a weapon that would change maritime history. They called it the lembus. If the Roman quinquer was a sledgehammer, the lembus was a switchblade. It was small, undecked, and powered by a single bank of OES, usually with only 50 men. It had no heavy ram, no towering castles, and no heavy armor. To a Roman admiral, it looked like a toy. This underestimation was fatal. The lembus possessed one attribute that the Romans could not replicate: speed. These vessels were designed with a shallow draft, allowing them to skim over hidden reefs and vanish up shallow river deltas where the heavy Roman quay would run ground. In the choppy, unpredictable waters of the Dalmatian coast, the lembus danced while the quinqueremes stumbled. The Illyrian tactics were a form of naval guerrilla. The warfare. They never lined up for the decisive set-piece battles the Romans adored. Instead, they operated in wolf packs. 4 or 5 lembi would rush a single isolated Roman transport. They didn't ram, they swarmed. Using their speed, they would pull alongside, lash the ships together, and flood the enemy deck with fierce infantry before the Romans could even rotate their heavy ballast day. As a nightmare of mathematics. A Roman warship cost a fortune to build and months to crew. An Illyrian lembus could be built in weeks from local timber and crewed by any Vils fisherman. Teuta could lose 10 ships to sink 1 Roman vessel and still come out ahead in the exchange. This technology was so effective that it terrified the merchant world. The lembus didn't just stay in the Adriatic. Raids reported as far south as the Peloponnese. The Illyrians had democratized naval violence. You didn't need a state treasury to threaten an empire. You just needed a fast boat and 50 hungry men. Rome found itself boxing with a shadow. The legions would land on an island, only to find the villages empty and the Illyrian fleet already gone, sailing downwind to raid the very supply lines the Romans had just lay behind. The invincible Roman navy was bleeding from 1,000 paper cuts, unable to pin down an enemy that refused to play by the rules of civilized warfare. The Senate realized too late that they weren't fighting a nation, they were fighting a methodology. To win, they would need more than just wood and iron, they would need treachery. In 229 BC, the Roman Republic stopped swatting at the fly and decided to burn down the forest. The Senate authorized a force that was terrifying in its excess. 200 warships and 20,000 infantry led by both consuls simultaneously. This was not a policing action, it was an annihilation force. The sheer displacement of water caused by the Roman fleet as it crossed the Otranto Strait sent a message that vibrated through the wooden hulls of every Illyrian ship. The game was over, but the Illyrian wars would not be decided by a clash of prows or a storm of arrows. They would be decided in the mind of one man, Demetrius of Pharos. Demetrius was Queen Teuta's most capable general. He had been entrusted with the defense of Corsair, modern-day Corfu, the strategic key to the Adriatic. He commanded a garrison that could have held out for months, bleeding thorough. Man supply lines dry. But Demetrius possessed a trait common among successful pirates: a total lack of loyalty to anything but his own survival. As the Roman armada darkened the horizon, blocking out the morning sun, Demetrius did the math. He saw Teuta's regency crumbling under the weight of her own ambition. He saw the infinite resources of Rome, and he saw an opportunity. Instead of ordering his archers to man the walls, he sent a rowboat to the Roman flagship. The deal was struck in whispers. Demetrius surrendered Corsair without a single drop of blood being spilled. In exchange, the Romans promised to install him as a client king, ruling over the islands he once defended for Teuta. It was a master stroke of Roman statecraft. They didn't just defeat the Illyrians, they decapitated them. But Corsair gone, the Illyrian defense line shattered like glass. The Roman legions landed and swept north, acting less like an army and more like a force of nature. City after city, Epidamnos Apollonia, Issa threw open their gates, eager to distance themselves from the pirate queen. The Romans accepted their surreners and kept marching, driving Teuta further and further into the wild interior. Teuta herself retreated to the fortress of Risen, tucked deep inside the twisting bay of Cotta. It was a natural stronghold, but she was isolated. Her allies had defected, her fleet was scattered, and her trusted general was now guiding the Roman legions to her doorstep. In 228 BC, she capitulated. The peace treaty was humiliating. Teuta was forced to abdicate her claims on the Greek cities, pay a CRI, pling tribute, and most painfully accept a limit on her navy. No more than 2 unarmed Illyrian ships were allowed to sail south of Lissus. The pirate empire was effectively grounded. Rome declared victory, packed up its legions and sailed home. Believing the Illyrian problem was solved, they left Demetrius of Pharos in charge, a puppet to watch over the Adriatic, but they had forgotten a fundamental rule of keeping wild animals. A wolf that bites its master once will inevitably bite again. Demetrius didn't want to be a puppet, he wanted to be a king. And while Rome turned its back to face a new threat rising in Carthage, the traitor began to sharpen his knives. History rarely offers a perfect villain, but Demetrius comes close. He was the ultimate survivor, a man who viewed loyalty as a currency to be spent, not saved. While Rome was paralyzed by the terrifying news that a Carthaginian general named Hannibal was marching war elephants towards the Alps, Demetrius decided the time had come to cash in his chips. He had been installed by the Senate to keep the Adriatic quiet. Instead, he turned it into his private kingdom, betting that Rome was too distracted by the existential threat of Carthage to notice a few broken rules. Demetrius tore up the peace treaty of 228 BC. He didn't just cross the forbidden line of Lissus, he sailed past it with 50 warships, raiding the Cyclades and terrorizing the Roman allies in Greece. He didn't stop at piracy. To secure his position, he married into the royal family of Macedonia, forging an alliance with King Philip V. This was Rome's worst nightmare realized, a bridge between the chaotic naval power of the Illyrians and the disciplined phalanxes of the East. Demetrius was no longer a pirate. He was a geopolitical architect, building an anti-Roman coalition. The Second Illyrian War was Rome's frantic attempt to close the back door before the house burned down. The Senate knew they couldn't fight Hannibal in Italy if their supply lines across the Adriatic were being severed by Demetrius. They dispatched Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a consul known for his grim efficiency, to crush the traitor. The campaign was a masterclass in Roman siege warfare. In a single week, the impregnable fortress of Demal was stormed and taken. The speed of the Roman advance caught Demetrius off guard. He retreated to his home island of Pharos, confident that his fortifications would hold. But the Romans didn't bother with a long siege. They staged a fake landing to draw Demetrius's troops out of the city, then ambushed them from the rear with a hidden force. Caught in a pincer movement, the king of the Adriatic saw his army evaporate. But true to his nature, Demetrius didn't die with his men. While his soldiers were being slaughtered, he slipped away a waiting ship and fled to the court of Philip V in Macedonia. Rome had won again, securing the Adriatic just in time to face Hannibal, but the victory was incomplete by letting Demetrius escape. They allowed a virus to spread. Demetrius would spend the rest of his life whispering poison into the ear of the Macedonian king, encouraging Philip to attack Rome when it was weakest. The Illyrian pirate had become a kingmaker, and his influence would drag Rome into decades of brutal conflict in the east. The snake had been chased out of the grass, but it had found a new, larger garden to infest. Fast forward 50 years to 168 BC. The world had changed. Rome was no longer just a powerful republic, it was the apex predator of the Mediterranean. But in the Illyrian capital of Scodra, a new king named General Teuta was about to make the same old mistake. The Third Illyrian War wasn't started by ambition, it was started by a con artist. The king of Macedonia, Perseus, was desperate for allies against the Roman juggernaut. He looked at Gentius and saw a useful idiot. Perseus offered the Illyrian king a staggering sum of 300 talents of silver to switch sides and attack Rome. The negotiation that followed is one of the most tragic comedies in ancient history. Gentius, wary of empty promises, demanded to see the money first. Perseus's envoys actually brought the silver to Illyria, allowing Gentius to stamp his royal seal on the wax safeguarding the treasure. Satisfied that the fortune was his, Gentius committed the one act that would make his betrayal irreversible. He arrested 2 Roman ambassadors and threw them into prison. It was the point of no return. But the moment news of the arrests reached Macedonia, Perseus pulled the rug out. He ordered the bearers of the silver to turn around and bring the money back home. He reasoned that Gentius was now already at war with Rome and didn't need to be paid to fight. Gentius had sold his kingdom for a fortune he never touched. The Roman response was terrifying. In its speed, The Senate didn't send a consul this time. They sent a prior named Anicius Gallus. Anicius didn't bother with complex maneuvers. He launched a blitzkrieg that would make modern generals envious. The entire war lasted only 30 days. Let that sink in. The Illyrian kingdom, which had terrified the Adriatic for a century, was dismantled in a single month. Gentius retreated behind the massive cyclopean walls of Scodra, hoping to withstand a siege. But his heart wasn't in it. His army was demoralized, his treasury was empty, and the Roman legions were relentless. The end was pathetic rather than heroic. Gentius asked for a 3-day truce to consider his options, hoping that a relief army would miraculously appear. He spent those 3 days waiting, likely drinking heavily, watching the horizon. No one came. When the truce expired, he didn't sally out for a glorious last stand. He walked out of the gates, fell to his knees in the dust before the Roman pra, and begged for his life. Rome was not merciful. The kingdom was dissolved. Gentius and his entire family were shackled and paraded through the streets of Rome in Anicius's triumph. As the crowds cheered the sight of the barbarian king in chains, the independent history of Illyria came to a whimpering end. The pirate empire was dead, but for the common people left behind in the Balkans, the real horror was just beginning. The war was over, but the exploitation had just begun. When the legions marched home, they left behind something far more dangerous than soldiers: the accountants. Rome did not annex Illyria to build schools or roads. They came to drain it. The Senate applied their favorite geopolitical formula, divide et impera, which means divide and rule. The once unified kingdom was sliced into 3 separate autonomous districts. It was a calculated amputation. Rome forbade marriage and trade between these districts. If you were an Aryan in the north, your cousin in the south might as well have lived on the un. The goal was to shatter the national identity that had produced kings like Adriatic and queens like Teuta. But political division was just the appetizer. The main course was economic extraction. The Romans arrived with an insatiable hunger for silver, and the ancient Balkans were sitting on veins of it. To manage this, the Senate didn't use government officials. They leased the collection of taxes and the operation of mines to private corporations known as the publicani. These were the venture capitalists of the ancient world, but armed with swords. They bid for contracts in Rome, paying the state up front, which meant every denarius they squeezed out of the Illyrian population above that bid was pure profit. The result was industrial-scale horror. The Roman economy in the provinces was fueled by a machine that consumed human beings. Thousands of Illyrian warriors, once the proud masters of the Adriatic, were marched into the dark, suffocating tunnels of the silver mines. Working conditions were a slow death sentence. The tunnels were narrow, unventilated, and lit only by flickering oil lamps that burned up the scarce oxygen. Miners worked in shifts that lasted for days, chipping away at rock while inhaling silica dust that turned their lungs to stone. If the rock didn't kill them, the brutality did. The publicani employed private security forces who enforced quotas with whips and clubs. There was no oversight, there were no human rights, there was only the quota. The wealth extracted from these hills paved the streets of Rome and funded the gladiator games that entertained mob. But back in Illyria, the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, felt like a suffocating blanket. The publicani seized land, confiscated livestock, and levied taxes on everything from the number of columns in your house to the number of slaves you owned. If you couldn't pay, you became the commodity. For over a century, the pressure built. The Illyrians were beaten, divided, and enslaved. But they were not broken. Beneath the surface, in the secret mountain passes and the deep forests where the Roman tax collectors dared not go, the old stories were still told. The memory of the lembus and the freedom of the sea didn't die. It went underground. Rome thought they were managing a colony. In reality, they were sitting on a powder keg, and the fuse was burning down towards the greatest explosion the empire would ever face. By 6 AD, the Roman Republic had become an empire ruled by the first Emperor Augustus. The world seemed stable, but in the mountains of Illyria, the pressure cooker was about to explode. The spark wasn't a tax or a beaten slave, it was a recruitment drive. Rome was planning a massive invasion of Germany and needed bodies to fill the ranks. They turned to their warlike subjects in the Balkans, demanding a levy of auxiliary troops. The Illyrians gathered as ordered. They stood in their formations holding Roman-issued swords, wearing Roman armor, and drilled in Roman tactics. But as they looked at the recruiting officers barking orders, a dangerous realization swept through the ranks. We are armed, we are trained, and there are more of us than them. The rebellion began not with a whisper, but with a roar. Led by a chieftain named Bat the Ditio, the Illyrians turned their weapons against their officers. Within days, the revolt spread like a wildfire in a drought. Another leader, Batau of the Bruce, joined the cause. The two Bats united the tribes in a way that neither Agron nor Teuta ever could. This was the Bellum Baton Arnhem, or the War of the Bee. It wasn't a distant board, a skirmish. It was an existential crisis. The rebels weren't just defending their homes, they were marching on Italy. Panic gripped Rome. For the first time in centuries, the Senate debated in terror. Emperor Augustus, usually the picture of stoic calm, stood before the Senate and declared that unless drastic measures were taken, the enemy could be within sight of Rome within 10 days. The empire went into total mobilization. Rome stripped the provinces of their garrisons. They bought freedom for thousands of slaves just to put bodies in uniforms. The future Emperor Tiberius was recalled from the German front to lead the defense. What followed was the most brutal conflict Rome would fight until the barbarian invasion centuries later. Rome ultimately fielded 15 legions, over half of their entire military strength, along with an equal number of auxiliaries. We're talking about nearly 200,000 men deployed to crush a piece of land the size of modern Bosnia. The war dragged on for 3 bloody years. The Illyrians fought with the ferocity of men who knew this was their last chance. They used the terrain, luring the heavy Roman columns into mountain ambushes and cutting off their supply line. Rome couldn't win by battle, so they won by starvation. Tiberius adopted a scorched earth policy, burning every village, slaughtering every herd of cattle and destroying every crop. Finally, in 9 AD, Batau the Ditio surrendered at the fortress of Andetrium. When Tiberius asked him why his people had rebelled with such savagery, Batau delivered one of history's most cutting lines. "You Roman are to blame, for you send as guardians of your flocks not dogs or shepherds, but wolves." But the revolt was crushed. But the cost was astronomical. The Illyrians had proven that they were the toughest fighters in the known world, and Rome, ever the pragmatist, decided that if they couldn't destroy this spirit, they would buy it. 2 centuries after Bau's revolt, the Roman Empire was not ruling the It was being eaten alive. This was the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year nightmare where Rome faced civil war, plague, economic collapse and invasion on every front. The soft towering elites of the Senate were powerless to stop the bleeding. The empire had split into 3 fractured chunks, and the end of Rome seemed inevitable. But salvation didn't come from the noble families of Ita. It came from the hard limestone hills of the ancient Balkans. After the Great Revolt, Rome had learned its lesson. Instead of fighting the Illyrians, they recruited them. The legions became filled with men from Dalmatia and Pannonia, men who grew up in the saddle, worshipped soldier gods, and viewed war as a natural state of being. By the mid-3rd century, the Roman army was effectively an army. And since the army now chose the emperor, the barbarians effectively took over the throne. Enter Aurelian. Born to a humble peasant family in Illyria, he rose through the ranks not by lineage, but by the sheer number of enemies he killed. His men called him Manu Adam, which means hand on hilt, because he was never without his weapon. When he seized the purple in 270 AD, he inherited a corpse. The EMP. Ire was broken. The Goths were ravaging the north. Queen Zenobia of Palmyra had stolen the wealthy east, and a breakaway GIC empire controlled the west. Aurelian didn't negotiate, he went to work. In a whirlwind campaign that lasted just 5 years, he did the impossible. He crushed the Goths. He marched east and shattered Zenobia's armies in the Syrian desert. He turned west and forced the GIC user to their knees. He stitched the bleeding pieces of the map back together with iron thread. When he returned to Rome, the Senate, the descendants of the men who had sneered at Teuta, had no choice but to bow before this rough-spoken soldier. They granted him the title Restitutor, or Restorer of the World. Aurelian was just the beginning. He was followed by Error Dionysian, another Illyrian who fundamentally reorganized the empire to survive for another 1,000 years. The irony is staggering. The very people Rome had tried to exterminate in the pirate wars had become the only ones strong enough to save the idea of Rome. The Illyrians didn't just conquer the empire from within, they became the empire. The wolves had become the shepherds, and without them, the light of Western civilization would have been extinguished centuries earlier. The final victory of the Illyrians was not written in blood but in stone, and it didn't happen in Rome. In the early 4th century, Constantine the Great, born in Nessus, a city deep in the heart of the Illyrian lands, made a decision that would dictate the course of human history. He decided that Rome, the city of the 7 hills, was no longer worthy of being the capital of the world. He looked east. He built a new Rome on the Bosphorus, a city that would bear his name, Constantinople. This was the ultimate subversion. The Illyrian emperors didn't just save the empire, they stole it. They took the center of gravity away from the Italian aristocrats who had once called them pirates, and moved it to their own backyard. Each. See Byzantine Empire that followed, which preserved the light of classical civilization for another 1,000 years, while Western Europe fell into the Dark Ages, was built on foundations laid by Illyrian pragmatism and military genius. Even Justinian the Great, the emperor who built the Hagia Sophia and codified the laws that still underpin modern legal systems, was born a peasant in the Illyrian region of Dardania. So what happened to the people themselves? Did they vanish? History is often written by the conquerors, and when the Slavs swept into the Balkans in the 6th and 7th centuries, the Illyrian name faded from the maps. But a people who survived the Greeks, the Celts, and the Romans do not simply disappear. Linguists and historians trace a direct line from the ancient Illyrians to the modern Albanian people. The Albanian language is a unique branch on the Indo-European tree, a living fossil that likely preserves the speech of the tribes that once defied the legions in the high mountains of Albania and Kosovo. The traditions of the clan, the fierce code of honor known as the Kanon, and the unyielding spirit of independence echo the world of Queen Teuta and King Agron. The story of the Illyrians is the ultimate underdog epic. They started as the enemies of Rome, the other, the barbarian, the pirate. They were hunted, defeated, partitioned, and enslaved. But they refused to be erased. They infiltrated the very machine that tried to crush them, climbed to the highest throne in the world, and steered the ship of civilization through its darkest storm. When Lucius Coranius sneered at Queen Teuta on that fateful day in 230 BC, he thought he was looking at a savage. He couldn't have known that he was looking at the ancestors of Rome's future saviors. The eagle may have landed in Italy, but for centuries its wings were kept aloft by the sons of Illyria. History isn't just dates and dead names. It's choices, betrayals, and consequences that echo for centuries. The story of the Illyrian reminds us that empires don't just fall from outside pressure. They are reshaped from within by the very people they try to dominate. If you enjoyed this journey into the forgotten shadows of the ancient world, make sure to like the video, subscribe to Crimson States, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Your support helps keep these untold stories alive. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Was Rome saved by the very people it once called barbarians? Or was its fate sealed from the beginning? Until next time, keep questioning the past, because history is never as simple as it seems.